Little Red Riding Hood gets eaten, and so does her grandmother. Nobody saves them. That's where I want to start, because the version most of us remember has been considerably nicer to us. You probably know the basic story, though. A young girl is sent through the woods carrying food for her grandmother. Somewhere along the way, she meets a wolf, and despite having every reason not to have a conversation with said wolf, she tells him where she's going. The wolf reaches the house first, eats the grandmother, puts on her clothing, climbs into bed, and waits. When Red Riding Hood arrives, something obviously isn't right. Grandmother has very large ears, very large eyes, very large hands, and famously, very large teeth. And then the wolf attacks her. This is normally around the point where another character enters the story. A huntsman discovers what has happened, cuts open the wolf, and pulls Red Riding Hood and her grandmother from its stomach. Depending on which version you're reading, they then fill the wolf with stones, it dies, and everyone except the wolf walks away having learned something useful. It's gruesome, but it's also comforting. The monster is real, but so is the person capable of killing it. Charles Perrault didn't include that part, though. When Perrault published Little Red Riding Hood in 1697, his version ended shortly after the conversation in grandmother's bed. The wolf reveals himself and then devours the girl. No rescue follows. Grandmother is still dead, Red too remains dead, and the wolf wins. Perrault then does something that would be considered slightly heavy-handed by modern standards and explains exactly what he meant. His moral warns young women that they should be cautious around wolves, particularly the ones who are charming, agreeable, and willing to follow them home. We can deduce that this is not really a story about wildlife. Perrault is talking about men. Then suddenly a children's story about a talking wolf becomes remarkably adult. But there is something clever about using a wolf for this scenario, because children need warnings long before they're capable of understanding everything they're being warned about. A parent can tell a child not to wander away alone. You can teach them not to tell strangers where you're going. You can explain that an adult asking a child to keep certain secrets is something that they should tell another trusted adult about. However, what you cannot reasonably do is sit a 6-year-old down at the kitchen table and provide a comprehensive explanation of sexual predation, murder, manipulation, kidnapping, and every other horrible motivation another human being may have. You cannot explain to them that there are people in the world who may want to consume them figuratively and literally, both body and soul. So you give these people fur, and you give them teeth, and you call them wolves. And suddenly the child understands. Don't leave the path, be careful who you trust, and don't tell strangers where you're going. Instead of explaining predation, you tell them about a wolf. And this isn't something unique to Red Riding Hood either. Once you start looking at older fairy tales this way, you realize that an alarming percentage of them amount to adults finding imaginative ways to explain terrible things to children. Take Hansel and Gretel. The children are abandoned during a famine and eventually discover a house made out of food. The witch doesn't construct a frightening house. She builds the most beautiful home imaginable to 2 starving children. They walk towards it excitedly, and only after they're inside does the old woman reveal what she intends to do with them. She wants to eat them. Again, the metaphor is remarkably straightforward. Someone offering you exactly what you desperately want is not necessarily doing it because they love you. Then there's Bluebeard, which barely bothers hiding how adult its subject matter is. A wealthy man marries a young woman and brings her into his enormous home. She is permitted to go almost anywhere with one exception. The one room is forbidden. So naturally, curiosity wins and she eventually opens it. Inside, she discovers the murdered bodies of his previous wives. There's plenty you can pull from Bluebeard. Curiosity, obedience, secrecy, marriage, domestic violence. But at its very center is a simple warning. Respectability doesn't guarantee safety. This dangerous man has money, he owns property, he has status he can marry, he looks like someone that society has given the stamp of approval. Behind one locked door are all the people who discovered otherwise. Cinderella takes the threat somewhere else entirely. There is no stranger, and there isn't even really a monster. The people hurting Cinderella are her own family. It's an uncomfortable lesson, but an important one. Children are naturally taught to associate home with safety and family with protection. Usually that's true, but sometimes, unfortunately, it is not. Snow White goes even further with this message because the danger comes from someone occupying an almost parental role. The queen doesn't attack Snow White openly. When she decides to kill her personally, she disguises herself and offers the girl something desirable. The apple has become so iconic that it's easy to forget the basic mechanics of the scene. A stranger gains someone's trust and offers them something poisoned. It's Red Riding Hood again, with a different monster and the same problem. There's a reason I keep coming back to fairy tales. I started this channel with Snow White, and somehow I keep ending up back in the same woods, looking for what these stories were really trying to say. Moving from that, even the Three Little Pigs, underneath all the architectural disputes and wolf-based property damage, teaches something extremely practical. One pig builds quickly from straw, another builds slightly better with sticks. But the third pig takes the problem seriously and builds from brick. Then the wolf arrives. Children may not know the phrase risk mitigation, but they absolutely understand the idea of a wolf blowing your shitty house down just fine. This is one of the things I really like about fairy tales, is that they're economical. A poisoned apple can communicate something that would take an adult 20 minutes to explain. A candy house can explain why temptation and danger sometimes arrive together. A locked room can teach suspicion. And a wolf can stand in for things a child won't have words for until much later. More than a century after Perrault, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm published Little Red Cap in 1812. The basic structure remains familiar. The girl meets the wolf reaches grandmother's house, grandmother is then eaten, then Red arrives and is eaten too. However, the story keeps going after this. A huntsman passing the house hears the wolf snoring. He investigates, realizes what has happened, and cuts open the wolf's stomach. Out comes Red Riding Hood, then grandmother, both alive, and the wolf is killed. It's the ending most of us inherited, and it changes the emotional logic of the story considerably. Perrault gives the listener consequences, yet the Grimms give the listener consequences and recovery. That's much closer to the way we tell children's stories now. We still want danger to exist because there isn't much point to teaching children that the world contains none, but we also want them to know that mistakes don't necessarily have to be fatal. And somewhere between Perrault and the Grimms, you can see two different philosophies of childhood. One says, I'm going to frighten you, but I'm also going to show you what to do afterwards. And the other says, I'm going to frighten you so you'll remember. At 5 years old, the wolf is simply a wolf. At 15, maybe he starts to mean something else. At 30, you again read Perrault's moral and realize he wasn't being particularly subtle in the first place. The words stay basically the same while your understanding of them changes. A child hears that the wolf ate Little Red Riding Hood and thinks, oh, I should be afraid of the wolf. An adult reads the same story and sees it as it is. The wolf speaks politely, gets information, disguises himself, and waits for her. Red arrives and speaks with him. She gets into bed, realizes what she's looking at, and then the wolf devours her body and soul. That's it. There's no huntsman. Nobody cuts open the wolf. Grandmother doesn't crawl out. Red doesn't crawl out. They're dead. That's it. End of story.